Natalie Mercer made the gate with less than 4 minutes to spare. She was still wearing her navy blue hospital scrubs. Her employee badge swung lightly against her chest as she hurried down the jet bridge. She had been awake since 3:40 that morning, called into the trauma unit before sunrise, and had spent the last 9 hours fighting to keep a construction worker alive after a catastrophic internal injury. She had not gone home. She had not slept. She had not even changed clothes. All she wanted was a quiet flight to Virginia, seat 2A. First class window. She settled into her seat and closed her eyes for what she hoped would be a few minutes of peace. Instead, she heard laughter. "Excuse me," a man's voice said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "I'm just curious, how does a nurse afford a seat up here?" More laughter followed. Natalie opened her eyes. Across the aisle sat Graham Whitmore, a wealthy CEO whose expensive watch flashed beneath the cabin lights. Beside him sat his wife, Evelyn, smiling as though the question had been genuinely amusing. Several nearby passengers glanced toward Natalie. Some looked embarrassed, others looked entertained. Natalie simply looked back out the window. She had endured worse things than strangers. Much worse. Then she stood to adjust her carry-on bag. As she reached into the overhead compartment, her sleeve shifted slightly. For less than a second, a small tattoo became visible near her shoulder. A black anchor, Roman numerals, 27. 3 rows behind her, a man froze. A glass stopped halfway to his lips. His expression changed instantly. Not curiosity, not surprise, recognition. The man slowly lowered his drink. Brigadier General Victor Callahan had spent 32 years serving his country. He had commanded Marines in places most Americans would never hear about. He had read thousands of classified reports, and 8 months earlier he had studied one report more carefully than any other. The report of Shadow Atlas, a covert unit, 13 operators, 1 mission, 11 dead, 2 survivors. The tattoo Natalie Mercer had unknowingly revealed existed on exactly 2 living people in the world. Victor stared at her. At the exhausted nurse everyone was mocking. At the woman carrying a burden almost nobody in America even knew existed. Then he quietly stood up. And suddenly the atmosphere inside first class changed, because the most powerful man on that aircraft had just recognized the most dangerous secret in the cabin, and the people laughing had absolutely no idea who they were laughing at. The flight had not even begun taxiing when Natalie realized sleep was no longer an option. Graham Whitmore was enjoying himself too much. He leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made Evelyn laugh again. The sound carried farther than either of them probably intended. Natalie kept her eyes on the runway outside. Years earlier, she might have reacted. Back then, she had been quicker to defend herself, quicker to answer, quicker to prove something. Life had changed that. Years in hospitals taught patience. Years before hospitals taught something even more valuable. Silence. Not the silence of weakness, the silence of control, the silence of knowing exactly who you are. The cabin door closed. Flight attendants completed final checks. Passengers settled into their seats. Yet Graham seemed unable to leave the matter alone. "You know," he announced casually, "I've always admired nurses. Very important work." A few passengers looked up. Natalie already knew where this was going. But first class isn't exactly cheap these days. More laughter. Evelyn smiled into her coffee. Natalie felt every eye nearby drifting toward her. Waiting, watching, expecting a response. Instead, she simply folded her hands in her lap. The same hands that had compressed bleeding arteries, started failing hearts, delivered terrible news to families, held dying patients when nobody else was there. Her businessman's opinion did not rank particularly high among her concerns. Across the cabin, Victor Callahan continued studying her. The exhaustion in her face, the hospital badge, the calm posture. Most of all, the tattoo he knew he had seen. He remembered the photograph attached to the after-action report. 13 operators standing in desert gear. One woman among them, Natalie Mercer, Shadow Atlas, the operator who had carried a wounded teammate through miles of hostile territory after everything had gone wrong. The woman who should not have survived. The woman who somehow had. Victor felt an old weight settling across his shoulders again. 8 months. 8 months since the mission. 8 months since 11 families received devastating news. 8 months since he had started carrying a photograph inside his jacket pocket every single day. Meanwhile, Graham Whitmore continued performing for his audience. The problem was that he had mistaken the room. He thought he was the most important person on the aircraft. He thought influence was measured in money, status, titles, board meetings. He had no idea that sitting quietly across the aisle was a woman whose courage could never be discussed publicly, a woman whose greatest achievements could never appear on a resume, a woman carrying 11 names on her conscience every day she woke up. And 3 rows behind him sat a general who knew the entire story. Victor slowly unfastened his seatbelt. The decision had been made. Graham Whitmore just didn't know it yet. And within the next few minutes, neither his money nor his confidence would be enough to protect him from the truth. Victor Callahan stood slowly. The movement itself was unremarkable. Most passengers never noticed it, but years of command had given him a certain presence, the kind that changed the atmosphere of a room before a single word was spoken. Natalie noticed. Not because she recognized him, because she had spent enough years reading people to recognize intent. She turned slightly in her seat as the tall, grey-haired man stepped into the aisle. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Something about his expression caught her attention. There was no curiosity there, no judgment, no pity, only recognition. A sensation she had not felt in a very long time. Victor stopped beside row 3. His gaze drifted toward the small hospital badge clipped to her scrubs. Natalie Mercer, he thought. The report photograph had been older. Her hair had been shorter, her face harder. The woman in the picture had looked like someone prepared to kick down a door in the middle of nowhere and disappear into darkness before sunrise. The woman sitting in seat 2A looked exhausted, human, worn down by grief and 12-hour shifts. But Victor knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving, especially with operators, especially with survivors. Across the aisle, Graham Whitmore was still talking. He had found a willing audience in the passenger behind him. "Things have changed," Graham said. "I remember when first class actually meant something." The passenger laughed politely. Evelyn smiled. Natalie's eyes returned to the window. She had heard worse. In hospitals, in airports, at grocery stores, people saw scrubs and assumed they understood everything. The salary, the education, the life. They never did. Victor finally stepped forward, one row, then another, until he stopped beside seat 2A. The cabin grew strangely quiet. Several passengers looked up. Even the flight attendant near the galley paused. Victor looked at Natalie for several seconds. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Shadow Atlas." Natalie's entire body became still, not tense, still. The kind of stillness that occurs when a person suddenly hears a name they thought had disappeared forever. Her eyes slowly lifted toward him. The world seemed to narrow. The aircraft, the passengers, the laughter, all of it faded. For 8 months, nobody had spoken those words to her. Nobody. Not in public, not in private, not anywhere. Because officially, Shadow Atlas did not exist. Victor saw the recognition immediately, the confirmation he already expected. 1,000 memories flashed through Natalie's mind. Desert nights, radio static, gunfire, 11 faces, 11 voices, 11 promises. Gone. Her hand instinctively moved toward her wrist. Beneath the sleeve of her scrub top rested a black paracord bracelet. 11 steel beads, one for each teammate who never came home. Victor noticed the movement, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Two survivors of the same tragedy, connected by names neither could forget. Then Graham's voice shattered the silence. "Can I help you?" he asked. Victor slowly turned. The businessman looked mildly annoyed, as if the interruption itself were an inconvenience, as if he still believed he controlled the room. Victor studied him calmly, the way he might study weather or terrain or any other obstacle. Then he spoke. His voice remained quiet, steady, completely controlled. "I believe," Victor said, "you owe this woman an apology." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The cabin became silent. Even Graham's smile faded, because for the first time that morning, someone had challenged him, and something deep inside him immediately realized this man was different. Very different. Victor Callahan didn't look angry. That was the frightening part. He looked absolutely certain, and certainty was far more dangerous than anger, especially when it belonged to a man who knew exactly who Natalie Mercer really was. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the first-class cabin felt strangely heavy. Not awkward, not uncertain, heavy. The kind of silence that appears when people sense something important has entered the room, but cannot yet identify what it is. Graham Whitmore stared at Victor Callahan. He was accustomed to being the dominant personality in every conversation. Boardrooms, fundraisers, corporate retreats. People usually adjusted themselves around him. They laughed when he joked, listened when he spoke, moved when he pushed. That rhythm had worked for decades, but it wasn't working now. Victor simply stood there, calm, still, unmoved. "Excuse me," Graham finally said. Victor's expression didn't change. "I said," he repeated quietly, "you owe this woman an apology." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Several nearby passengers pretended not to listen, while clearly listening to every word. Natalie remained silent. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't nervous. If anything, she looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying grief longer than anyone should have to. Graham laughed. It sounded forced, smaller than before. "And who exactly are you?" Victor regarded him for a moment, not with hostility, with assessment. The same way experienced commanders evaluate situations before acting. The same way they identify threats, weaknesses, intentions. "I don't believe my name matters." The answer irritated Graham immediately. "Then perhaps you should sit back down." Victor nodded slightly, as though considering the suggestion. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. Half the cabin watched. Natalie watched too. Victor removed a phone. Nothing more. No badge. No identification. Just a phone. He held it casually in one hand. "If I make a single call," Victor said calmly, "this aircraft returns to the gate." The words landed like a hammer. No shouting, no drama, no threats, just certainty, absolute certainty. The effect was immediate. The flight attendant near the galley froze. A businessman across the aisle stopped typing. Even Evelyn's posture changed, because everyone recognized confidence. And this wasn't confidence. This was authority. Real authority. The kind that didn't need witnesses. Graham looked at the phone, then back at Victor. For the first time all morning, doubt appeared in his eyes. His upcoming board meeting suddenly seemed much closer, much more fragile. Months of preparation, millions of dollars potentially involved. Investors flying in from around the country. The consequences of delay began calculating themselves automatically inside his head. Victor never blinked, never rushed, never added another word, because he didn't need to. Natalie knew exactly what she was seeing. She had seen officers like him before. Not many, but enough. Men who had carried impossible decisions for years. Men who understood consequences better than most people understood comfort. And she realized something. Victor wasn't standing up because he felt sorry for her. He wasn't rescuing her. He wasn't playing hero. He was standing up because something inside him considered silence unacceptable. That realization affected her more than she expected. Across the aisle, Graham cleared his throat. The cabin waited. Everyone knew what was coming. Nobody knew whether his pride would allow it. For several long seconds, he fought himself. Natalie could almost see it happening. The ego, the embarrassment, the realization that he had misjudged someone completely. Finally, Graham exhaled. The sound carried farther than it should have. His shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time that morning, he looked directly at Natalie. Not at her scrubs, not at her badge, at her, the actual person. His voice was noticeably quieter when he spoke. "I'm sorry." The words seemed difficult for him, painfully difficult. Victor remained motionless, still watching, still waiting, because both men understood the apology wasn't finished. Not yet, and everyone in the cabin knew it too. The real moment was still coming. The moment when Graham Whitmore would have to look directly into the eyes of the woman he had mocked all morning and finally confront the truth about himself. And that challenge was proving far harder than anything money had ever solved. Graham Whitmore swallowed hard. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, he found himself without a clever remark, without an audience, without an advantage. The entire cabin was watching. The woman behind him had stopped pretending to read her magazine. The businessman across the aisle had closed his laptop. Even the flight attendant seemed frozen in place. Everyone was waiting. Natalie met his eyes calmly. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, no desire to humiliate him. Strangely, that made the situation worse, because Graham suddenly realized she had never been competing with him. Not once. The competition had existed entirely inside his own head. Victor Callahan remained standing in the aisle, silent, patient. His presence alone made it impossible to escape the moment. Graham finally turned fully toward Natalie. His voice sounded different now, smaller, human. "I'm sorry, Miss Mercer." The words came slowly. "I shouldn't have said those things." The cabin remained silent. Graham continued, "I made assumptions about you." He looked down briefly. As it turns out, those assumptions were wrong. Beside him, Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. The apology had forced her into a position she could no longer avoid. For the last 20 minutes, she had laughed at every joke, supported every comment, encouraged every insult. Now she found herself staring at her own reflection, and she didn't particularly like what she saw. Her gaze moved toward Natalie. "I owe you an apology too." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Natalie looked at both of them. For several seconds, she said nothing. The silence stretched. Not because she wanted to punish them, because she was deciding what mattered. Most people would have enjoyed this moment. Most people would have made Graham suffer a little. After all, he had earned it. But Natalie had spent too many years around real suffering. Too many years watching families lose loved ones. Too many years understanding how fragile life actually was. Compared to that, this felt very small. Finally, she nodded once. A simple gesture. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. "I appreciate that." Relief immediately flashed across Graham's face. Victor noticed it too. The businessman thought the moment was over. He was wrong. Natalie leaned back in her seat. Then she said something that caused the entire cabin to become quiet again. "I hope your meeting goes well, Mr. Whitmore." Graham blinked. The response clearly wasn't what he expected. Natalie glanced out the window. The aircraft was beginning to push back from the gate. Morning sunlight reflected across the tarmac. For a moment, she simply watched it. Then she finished her thought. "Some things are worth being late for. Nobody spoke. The words landed differently than any insult could have, because they weren't meant as an attack. They were simply true. Victor felt a faint sense of admiration, not because of what she said, because of how she said it. No bitterness, no resentment, no attempt to prove a point, just perspective, the kind that only comes from carrying genuine loss. Graham looked away first. His shoulders lowered slightly. Something inside him had shifted, maybe only a little, but enough. The cabin slowly began returning to normal. Passengers reopened laptops. Conversations resumed. Flight attendants continued preparations. Yet something had changed. The energy felt different now. Lighter, quieter, more thoughtful. Victor finally slipped his phone back into his jacket. The confrontation was finished. But the reason he had approached Natalie in the first place remained. The tattoo, the bracelet, hidden beneath her sleeve. The names neither of them could forget. As the aircraft rolled toward the runway, Victor made a decision. There was something he had carried for 8 months, something that belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. Slowly he moved into the empty seat beside Natalie. Then he reached inside his jacket pocket and removed a photograph that had not left his possession for a single day since the mission ended. The moment Natalie saw it, her breath caught, because staring back at her were 13 faces, and 11 of them were gone forever. Natalie stared at the photograph. For a moment, the aircraft disappeared. The passengers disappeared. The conversation disappeared. There was only the picture. 13 people standing beneath a desert sun. 13 operators wearing dust-covered gear. 13 faces, frozen in a moment none of them knew would become precious. Victor placed the photograph gently on the tray table between them. Neither touched it. Neither needed to. Natalie's eyes moved slowly across the image. Ryan Keegan, Cole Maddox, Trevor Briggs, Nolan Pierce, Ethan Barrett, one face after another, one memory after another. She remembered the sound of their laughter, the arguments, the jokes, the nicknames, the way they complained about terrible coffee during deployments. Small details, ordinary details. The details that somehow hurt the most after someone was gone. A knot formed in her chest. 8 months. 8 months of carrying them alone. The hospital had helped keep her busy. Long shifts, double shifts, emergency rooms, trauma patients, broken bodies that needed immediate attention. People she could still save. People she could still help. But grief was patient. It waited. Every night, every quiet moment, every empty apartment, it waited. Victor watched her carefully. The photograph looked different in her hands, more real, more painful. He had carried it every day since the mission, but carrying a memory was not the same as carrying the people inside it. Natalie finally reached out. Her fingertips touched one corner of the picture, very lightly, as though she were afraid it might disappear. Her eyes stopped on a young man standing near the center, Logan Shepard. 28 years old, former Army Ranger, the funniest member of Shadow Atlas, at least according to everyone except Logan himself. Natalie smiled faintly. Then the smile vanished. He hated taking pictures. Victor nodded. I know. He always complained. He complained about everything. A soft laugh escaped her. The first genuine laugh Victor had heard from her. Small, brief, but real. For a moment it felt like Logan was there, standing between them, making some sarcastic comment, rolling his eyes. Then the feeling faded. Natalie's gaze moved again, to another face, then another, and another, until eventually it stopped on her own image. The woman staring back from the photograph looked unfamiliar, stronger perhaps, harder, less tired. The Natalie in the picture still believed all 13 of them would come home. The Natalie sitting in seat 2A knew better. Her hand drifted toward her bracelet. 11 steel beads, 11 names. Every morning before work, she touched each bead, not as a ritual, not as punishment, as remembrance, a promise. The world might forget. She wouldn't. Victor noticed her fingers resting on the bracelet. He had read about it in the report. A single sentence buried inside dozens of pages. Surviving operators elected to wear memorial bracelets containing 11 steel markers. At the time, it had seemed like a detail. Now it felt like the entire story. Marcus still wears his, Victor said quietly. Natalie's eyes lifted. For a second, genuine surprise appeared on her face. "You've seen him?" Victor nodded. "Twice." The surprise faded. Something else replaced it. Hope. Carefully guarded hope. The kind that appears when someone mentions a person you love, but haven't seen in too long. "How is he?" Victor hesitated, not because the answer was bad, because the answer was complicated. "He misses them." Natalie looked back down at the photograph. "So do I." Neither spoke for several moments. Outside the window, clouds drifted beneath the aircraft. Inside the cabin, the world remained quiet. Then Victor reached into his jacket pocket again. This time he removed something smaller. A folded document on cream-colored government letterhead. He placed it beside the photograph. Natalie stared at it, a strange feeling settling into her chest. Because she already knew this conversation was about to become much more difficult and much more important. Victor looked at the 11 beads around her wrist. Then he spoke softly. "There is something you deserve to know." And for the first time in 8 months, Natalie felt her heart begin to race. Natalie looked at the folded document but made no attempt to open it. Some instincts never disappeared. One of them was knowing when information had weight. This had weight. Victor rested his hands quietly on his knees. For a few moments, neither spoke. The aircraft had reached cruising altitude. Passengers around them had returned to their routines. Laptops glowed, coffee cups sat half empty. Soft conversations drifted through the cabin. Yet inside row 2, the atmosphere felt entirely different. A world separated from everyone else. Finally, Natalie broke the silence. Her voice was calm, steady, but Victor immediately recognized the effort behind it. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." Her fingers touched one of the steel beads on her bracelet. Then another. Then another. 11 names. 11 memories. 11 reasons she had not slept properly in 8 months. When she finally spoke, the question was simpler than Victor expected, and infinitely harder. "Did you know?" Victor's jaw tightened slightly. Natalie held his gaze. Did leadership know not all of us were coming home? There it was, the question, the one buried beneath every report, every ceremony, every sleepless night, the question no one wanted to ask, and no one wanted to answer. Victor looked out the window for a moment. Clouds drifted below, bright white beneath the morning sun. Then he looked back at her and chose honesty, complete honesty. The intelligence assessment estimated a 60% probability of full extraction. Natalie said nothing. Victor continued. The remaining 40% represented varying levels of casualty risk. Still, she remained silent, listening, the way soldiers listen when they need the truth more than comfort. The mission remained within approved operational parameters. A faint smile touched Natalie's face. It wasn't amusement, it wasn't anger, it was recognition. Recognition of language she had heard her entire military career. Approved parameters, acceptable risk. Strategic necessity. Words that sounded reasonable on paper. Words that felt very different when attached to names. Victor saw it too, and continued. I've reviewed those numbers every day for 8 months. Natalie looked at him. What changed? Nothing. The answer came immediately. That's the problem. Victor exhaled slowly. The math never changes. His eyes drifted toward the photograph, toward 13 operators frozen in time. The report still says 60%. The analysis still supports the decision. The objective was still critical. He paused. His voice lowered. But every day I look at that picture, and I wonder if there was something I missed. For the first time, emotion entered his expression. Not dramatic emotion, something quieter, more dangerous. Regret. I've read every page of the after-action report. Natalie listened carefully. Every page, Victor repeated. The intelligence files, the communications logs, the satellite recordings, the witness statements. He looked directly at her, and one section more than any other. Natalie already knew which one. The extraction, the final hours, the part where everything collapsed, the part nobody talked about. Victor nodded slightly. As long as I live, I'll never forget reading what happened after the ambush. The cabin seemed to disappear again. The photograph, the bracelet, the mission, everything pulling them backward through time. You carried Marcus out. Natalie's eyes lowered. You carried him for miles. Victor's voice remained steady. Wounded. Under pursuit, running out of ammunition, running out of water, running out of options. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. A memory threatened to surface. Dust, smoke, blood. Screaming over the radio, she pushed it back down. Not yet. Victor saw the reaction and understood immediately. The mission was still alive inside her, not as history, as something ongoing, something unfinished. Natalie opened her eyes again. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. The mission wasn't the hardest part. Victor frowned slightly. No? She shook her head. A sadness settled across her face. The kind that only appears when someone is preparing to share something they have carried alone for far too long. The hardest part, she whispered, came the next morning. And as Victor watched her, he realized he was about to hear a truth that no classified report had ever captured. Natalie stared through the airplane window, but she wasn't seeing clouds anymore. She wasn't seeing sunlight. She wasn't seeing the aircraft. She was seeing the desert. The memory returned with a force that made her chest tighten. 8 months disappeared. Suddenly she was back there, back inside the final mission of Shadow Atlas. Back on the night, everything changed. We were already inside the compound when it happened, she said quietly. Victor listened without interrupting. Natalie's eyes never left the window. The intelligence was good. At least we thought it was. She paused. A faint bitterness entered her voice. The first 20 minutes went exactly according to plan. She remembered every detail. The darkness, the heat, the silence before entry. 13 operators moving through the target building with the precision that came from years of working together. Nobody needed instructions. Nobody needed explanations. They knew each other too well. Each movement was instinct. Each decision automatic. Shadow Atlas had completed 26 successful operations before that night. They trusted one another completely. Then everything changed. The explosion happened on the 3rd floor. Victor remained still. Natalie's fingers tightened around one of the steel beads. There wasn't supposed to be an explosive device there. Her voice lowered. But there was. The blast shattered an entire section of the building. Concrete collapsed. Dust filled the corridors. Emergency lights activated. The mission instantly transformed from an operation into a survival fight. Natalie could still hear it. The alarms, the radio traffic, the confusion, the screaming. For a moment, her breathing slowed, as though she were hearing it all again. Logan was closest. Victor lowered his eyes. Natalie continued. He pushed 2 operators clear before the ceiling came down. Silence. He saved them. Her throat tightened. He didn't make it. Neither spoke for several seconds. The cabin around them remained distant, almost unreal. Natalie continued anyway, because once the memories started moving, they refused to stop. The ambush began less than a minute later. The enemy had known. Somehow, somewhere, the mission had been compromised. Gunfire erupted throughout the compound. Hallways became kill zones. Escape routes disappeared. The carefully designed extraction plan collapsed within minutes. We were fighting in every direction. Victor had read those words dozens of times, but hearing them from her sounded different. Reports never carried emotion. People did. Natalie's eyes closed briefly. I remember hearing Ryan over the radio. Her voice softened. He sounded calm. A sad smile appeared. He always sounded calm. Victor waited. Natalie swallowed. His last transmission wasn't tactical. Victor already knew what came next. The report had recorded it, but hearing it spoken aloud hurt more. He told us to keep moving. A pause. He told us he'd buy us time. Natalie looked down. The steel beads pressed against her fingers. He knew exactly what that meant. Victor felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, because every operator on that team had known. Every single one. The mission had become a chain of sacrifices. One person staying behind, then another, each buying minutes for the people still moving. Minutes paid for with lives. Natalie exhaled slowly. By the time they reached the outer perimeter, only 3 members of Shadow Atlas remained together. Natalie, Marcus, and Trevor Briggs. The memory sharpened. Trevor holding security near the extraction route. Marcus already wounded. Blood everywhere. The sound of approaching vehicles. The impossible mathematics of survival. Trevor looked at me. Her voice nearly broke. Just looked at me. Victor remained silent. He told me to get Marcus out. Natalie's eyes filled with tears for the first time. Not many, just enough. He never said goodbye. Another pause. He didn't need to. Outside the aircraft window, sunlight reflected across the clouds. Inside the cabin, Natalie finally looked at Victor. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered the words that still haunted her every night. When the shooting finally stopped, her hand trembled slightly. There were only 2 of us left, and for the first time since the conversation began, Victor realized the hardest part of her story had not happened inside that compound. It had happened after she survived. For several moments after Natalie finished speaking, neither she nor Victor said anything. The aircraft hummed steadily around them. Passengers talked quietly. Coffee cups rattled softly whenever the plane encountered a pocket of turbulence. Normal life continued. But inside row 2A, neither of them felt particularly connected to normal life. Natalie's eyes remained fixed on the photograph. 13 faces, 11 gone, 2 remaining. The arithmetic never changed. That was the cruel part. No matter how much time passed, the number stayed exactly the same. Victor finally spoke. What happened after extraction? Natalie let out a slow breath. A humorless smile appeared. That's the part nobody understands. Victor nodded. He had suspected as much. Most people believed survival was the happy ending. Most people believed the difficult part ended once the shooting stopped. Reality was rarely that simple. Natalie looked down at her bracelet. The 11 steel beads rested against her wrist, smooth from constant contact, worn from 8 months of being touched every day. The hardest part wasn't the mission. Victor had heard those words before. Now he understood them better. It was Germany. Her voice softened. The military hospital. The memory returned instantly. White walls, bright lights, the smell of disinfectant, machines beeping quietly in the darkness. Natalie remembered opening her eyes, remembered the confusion, remembered trying to sit up despite the pain. At first, she hadn't understood where she was, or what day it was. Then she saw Marcus, 2 beds away, alive, barely, but alive. The relief lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then she noticed the empty beds. 1, 2, 3, 4. She stopped counting at first. Her mind refused. Her heart already knew. But eventually reality forced its way through. There should have been 13 beds occupied. There were 2. Only 2. Natalie's eyes glistened slightly. That's when it became real. Victor remained silent. The mission was over. She swallowed. There were no more radio calls, no more objectives, no more chances to fix anything. The aircraft seemed quieter somehow, even though nothing had changed. The number became permanent. Her fingers moved across the bracelet, one bead at a time. 11, a pause. 11 yesterday, 11 today, 11 forever. Victor felt something tighten inside his chest, because there was nothing he could say to that. No rank, no speech, no explanation. Some truths simply existed. Natalie looked toward the folded government document, still resting beside the photograph. Victor followed her gaze. It concerns Shadow Atlas. She didn't reach for it. What kind of concern? Victor answered carefully. The review process is finally moving. That caught her attention. She looked at him fully. Victor continued. The department is preparing formal recognition. Natalie's expression remained unreadable. The names will be acknowledged. The mission will be documented. The record will become permanent. A brief silence followed. Victor had expected some reaction. Surprise, relief, maybe even gratitude. Instead, Natalie simply stared at the bracelet. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. They don't need permission to matter. Victor blinked. Natalie continued. They mattered when they were alive. Her fingers touched another bead, and they still matter now. The words landed harder than anything else she had said, because they were completely genuine. She wasn't angry. She wasn't dismissing the recognition. She simply measured remembrance differently than bureaucracies did. Victor looked at the photograph, at Logan, Ryan, Trevor, the others, then back at Natalie. What if the country finally learns what they did? Natalie smiled sadly. The country should. A pause. They deserve that. Her eyes lowered again. But every morning before work, she touched the bracelet. I say their names. Victor felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Natalie continued quietly. So does Marcus. Another pause. Trust me, General. Her smile grew softer. They've never been forgotten. For the first time since boarding the aircraft, Victor had no response. Because in that moment he realized something. The government was trying to preserve a record. Natalie was preserving people, and there was a profound difference between the two. The aircraft began its gradual descent, but neither of them noticed. Both were still carrying 11 names between them, and somewhere ahead, waiting in a hospital room in Virginia, was the only other person in the world who truly understood what those 11 names weighed. The plane touched down in Virginia shortly before noon. Passengers immediately began reaching for phones. Seat belts clicked open. Conversations resumed. The ordinary rhythm of travel returned. Natalie remained seated. For a moment, she simply stared out the window. The conversation with Victor still lingered in her thoughts. The photograph, the name, the document. 8 months of silence somehow compressed into a few hours at 30,000 feet. Beside her, Victor stood. He picked up the photograph carefully. The edges were worn from constant handling. Natalie looked at it one last time before he returned it to his jacket pocket. Then Victor extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, respectful, nothing more, nothing less. You should see him, Victor said quietly. Natalie already knew who he meant. Marcus. She nodded. I will. Victor hesitated. Then he added something she would remember for years. You carried them farther than anyone could have asked. Natalie lowered her eyes. No. Her fingers touched the bracelet. We carried each other. Victor understood immediately. That was how operators thought. Not individuals. Teams. Always teams. He gave a single nod and stepped into the aisle. A few minutes later, they walked separate directions through the terminal. The general toward a government vehicle waiting outside. Natalie toward a taxi. Neither looked back. Neither needed to. Some conversations ended properly the first time. The drive to Naval Medical Center Portsmouth took less than 30 minutes. Natalie spent most of it staring out the window. The city passed by unnoticed. Traffic lights, buildings, people living ordinary lives. The world had kept moving for 8 months. Sometimes that still surprised her. The hospital appeared ahead. Large, clean, familiar, too familiar. Military hospitals all shared certain characteristics. The smell, the silence, the unspoken understanding carried by everyone inside them. Natalie paid the driver and stepped out. She was still wearing her scrubs, still carrying her hospital badge, still exhausted. But now another feeling sat beneath the exhaustion. Nervousness. Real nervousness. She hadn't seen Marcus in person since Germany. Video calls didn't count. Text messages didn't count. This was different. She entered the building. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" Natalie smiled politely. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway." The woman typed briefly, then nodded. "Room 414. Natalie thanked her and walked toward the elevators. Each step felt heavier than the last. 4th floor, long hallway, white walls, fluorescent lights, the distant sound of medical equipment. Suddenly she felt 20 years older. The bracelet seemed heavier. The memories louder. Room 414 appeared at the end of the corridor. Natalie stopped, just stopped. For several seconds, she couldn't move. Everything from the morning pressed against her chest. The flight, the confrontation, Victor, the photograph, the letter, the memories she had spent months avoiding. All of it seemed to gather outside that door, waiting. She stared at the room number. One simple number, one ordinary hospital room. Yet beyond it sat the only person on earth who truly understood. The only other witness, the only other survivor. Natalie slowly raised her hand, then lowered it again. Suddenly, she wasn't afraid of what Marcus might say. She was afraid of what she might feel. 8 months of grief had become routine. Pain had become familiar. Seeing Marcus would make everything real again. A soft laugh escaped her. "Still avoiding difficult things," she whispered. That sounded exactly like something Logan would have said. The thought made her smile. Then she knocked. A voice came from inside, stronger than she expected. "Come in." Natalie's heart skipped once. She opened the door. Marcus Holloway sat upright in the hospital bed, older somehow, thinner. A scar crossed the left side of his face. His injured arm rested in a support brace. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stared at one another. 2 survivors, 2 witnesses, 2 people carrying the same 11 names. Then Marcus looked down. His eyes found the bracelet on her wrist. 11 steel beads. His gaze shifted to his own wrist. An identical bracelet rested there. The same 11 beads. The same 11 names. When he looked back up, something changed in his expression. For the first time in 8 months, Natalie saw a genuine smile appear on his face. And suddenly she knew she wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. For several seconds, neither Natalie nor Marcus spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Some reunions began with excitement. Others began with silence. This was one of those. Natalie stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, painting long golden lines across the floor. Marcus leaned back against his pillow and studied her carefully. "You look terrible," he said. Natalie laughed. A real laugh. The first completely unguarded laugh she had experienced in months. "You should see a mirror." Marcus nodded. "Fair point." For a moment, they simply smiled at each other. The tension dissolved. Not completely, but enough. Natalie pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. Neither asked how the other was doing. They already knew. Some questions didn't need answers. The bracelet on Marcus's wrist caught the sunlight. 11 steel beads, exactly like hers. Marcus noticed her looking. His expression softened. "I still touch them every morning." Natalie nodded. "Me too." Silence returned. Comfortable this time. The kind shared by people who have survived the same storm. Eventually, Marcus spoke again. "You saw Callahan, didn't you?" Natalie's eyebrows rose. "How did you know?" Marcus smiled. "Because he's the only person stubborn enough to carry guilt for 8 straight months." Natalie laughed again. That sounded accurate. Very accurate. "He told me about the review." Marcus nodded slowly. "So it's finally happening." The room grew quiet once more. The recognition process, the official record, the ceremony, the names, everything that had remained hidden for so long. Natalie studied the 11 beads. "What do you think?" Marcus looked toward the window. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he shrugged. "I think Logan would complain about the dress code." Natalie burst out laughing. Marcus joined her. Suddenly, they were both laughing. Not because anything was funny, because Logan really would have complained. Loudly, relentlessly. The laughter faded, but something important remained behind. Warmth. For the next several hours they talked about everything and nothing. They remembered Trevor's terrible singing voice, Ryan's obsession with coffee, Cole's habit of stealing snacks from everyone else's pack, the endless arguments, the inside jokes, the small moments that never appeared in reports. The moments that made people human. As the afternoon passed, the room gradually filled with ghosts. Not frightening ghosts, beloved ones. 11 absent friends sitting quietly among them, listening, remembered, alive in stories. At one point, Marcus reached into the bedside drawer and removed a folded piece of paper. Natalie recognized it immediately. A list. 11 names. Marcus handed it to her. The handwriting was worn from use. "I read them every night." Natalie's throat tightened. "So do I." Marcus smiled. "Good." A long silence followed. Outside, the afternoon sun began sinking lower over the city. Inside room 414, something that had been broken for 8 months finally began to heal. Not completely. Some wounds never fully disappeared. But healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about carrying the weight differently, sharing it, allowing someone else to hold part of it. As evening approached, Natalie stood to leave. Marcus looked at her bracelet, then at his own. 22 steel beads between 2 survivors. 11 names, 1 promise, never forgotten. At the door, Natalie paused. She looked back. Marcus was smiling again, the genuine smile she had thought might be gone forever. And for the first time since waking up in that hospital in Germany 8 months earlier, she felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not perfect peace, not permanent peace, but enough. Enough to take the next step, enough to keep moving forward. Outside the room, life continued. Cars moved through the city. People hurried home from work. The world remained unaware of Shadow Atlas, unaware of the sacrifices, unaware of the 11 names carried on 2 matching bracelets. And that was all right, because remembrance did not require recognition. The world didn't need to know. Natalie and Marcus knew. Victor Callahan knew. And most importantly, the 11 men who had given everything would never disappear as long as someone still spoke their names. As Natalie walked down the hallway, sunlight fading behind her, she touched the bracelet once more. 11 steel beads, 11 friends, 11 promises kept. And for the first time in a very long time, the weight felt lighter. Not because it had become smaller, because she finally understood she was no longer carrying it alone.